Hello and welcome to the second part of this three-part series on the practice of pyrotheology. So this is a pyro seminar, but I'm doing three in a row about what pyrotheology looks like in practice. And in the first session, I really delved into what a liturgy is like what is the point of it? What is it trying to achieve? What are the roles of different people within it? So it was kind of theoretical, and I did what I always do wrong, and I got a good critique of this recently, actually in relation to the doc that I was just talking about before we officially started, that I get very excited about the subtext of things, and I get very excited about the concept and what's kind of going on under the surface. And we didn't put much meat on the bones. So the whole idea of like pyrotheology in practice, people were going, we're going to actually talk about what it looks like, look at these gatherings and how they come about and how you actually create them. And then I don't think I did any of that. But I wanted to set the scene and talk about transformance art, because basically there's two wings to this, right? Pyrotheology in practice has transformance art on one side and decentering practices on the other. So those are kind of the two main technologies of pyrotheology. And we looked at the theory of transformance art in the first session. So now in this session, it's going to be much more conversational. I'm just going to tell some stories, going to give you some examples, and I'm going to kind of put some flesh on the bones of what we talked about. If you haven't heard that first session, definitely go back to it after this and kind of get caught up in the theory. And then in the next session, I want to look at the decentering practices. Okay, so what is transformance art? What does it look like in practice? So I'm going to tell you, this is going to be fun for me, a little bit, self-indulgent, right? I'm going to talk a little bit about how Icon began. When I was about 20, it must have been 23, 24. So I was in my early 20s, and I had been exposed to a movement called the alternative worship movement. It's called alt worship. And alt worship was kind of a precursor to the emerging church. And it was, to be honest, a lot more radical in its day. It was, this is in the 90s, and it was there was a lot of rave culture was big, and there were these groups in England that were experimenting with different forms of community and different forms of spirituality, different forms of church life. The biggest ones were called Nos. Nos was the very biggest, and it imploded. That's a really interesting story we can't get into now, but Nos was the most radical of them, and it combined kind of rave culture with, interestingly, kind of Matthew Fox. Before Matthew Fox, they were into John Wimber, and also with psychedelics, and it was very experimental. And then there was the Late Service. They were in Scotland, and then there was a group called Vox, and there was a group called Moot, and there were various others, but these were very interesting communities. And I went over when in my early 20s. I don't know how I got connected with them, but I went over to a conference and I was exposed to this, and I was kind of blown away by it. Intuitively, I was fascinated by it. I felt there was something important going on in these groups. And so when I came back to Northern Ireland, I wanted to do something similar. Now, I was part of something called the Siren Project, which was run by my good friend Adam Turkington, who I run Wake Festival with now. So the Siren Project was, it's really hard to describe, but we took a topic. It could be anything like food or taste or color or like very abstract topics. And then we would create an immersive environment with music and interviews and maybe some spoken words, kind of poetry and ritual and all these elements. And we would create this really weird, it felt like a cross between a cult and a talk show, right? And it was very fun. And it was, and Adam really ran that, and I was kind of the co-host. So the Siren Project was where we were experimenting with just very creative ways of creating an environment that felt that really was immersive, that got you to start thinking about something in a different way, right? So alt worship movement and the Siren Project were in the background. I was also part of a church at the time. And then I started Icon. And, very briefly, there was a bar called the Menagerie that I always liked. It was a very cool bar in Belfast. And I kind of wanted to use it for something. I didn't know what for. I was influenced by the Siren Project, influenced by the alt worship movement. I was like, I want to do something similar. And I was doing a master's at the time in political theory and social criticism. And so I was reading a lot of continental philosophers, and I was like, I want to bring all of this together. And I think this bar would be the place. And at the time I was learning French, right? I did terribly at French, but technically to do postgraduate work in continental philosophy, I had to speak another language. And I went to a very bad school, had no qualifications when I left school. So I had to kind of start learning French. But it was just a promise. They said, listen, learn a language. We like your work. You're in the PhD program. You're in the master's program. No problems. But it would help if you learn French. So I gave it a go. It was terrible. But I got on well with the French tutor. And we went out for a drink one night. And I was in the bar, the Menagerie, with her. And we were chatting. And I was saying, I want to do something with this bar. And she was like, why don't you just go up and ask Chris, who was the manager? And I was like, okay. So I went up to Chris and I said, Chris, I would love to, it was either Chris or Francie, they were the two managers. Like, I'd love to do something in your bar on a Sunday night, right? It was a Sunday night when I was in there and there was nobody there. It was like 3 people drinking. There was always this one guy at the end of the bar drinking tea, and there was us and maybe one other person. And I said, listen, can I just do something in your bar once a month on a Sunday? And he said, well, what's it like? And I said, well, it's hard to explain, but it'll be music and art, and it'll be kind of around kind of a type of a religious theme. But, it's not going to be dogmatic or anything like that. And he was like, yeah, okay. He says, I'll put you in the books, give it a try. And so the next month I was supposed to do an event. And suddenly I was like, oh my goodness, right, what do I do? So I did what you do in psychoanalysis, which is you pretend you know what you're doing. So I got a theme, I was going to call it Apocalypse. And I kind of put word out that this was going to happen, and I got a musician friend, I got a poet writer friend, a few other people together, and we started to plan, and it started to come to fruition. And then like 60 people showed up that night. All these people came. It's called Apocalypse. It was about opening ourselves up to a world that we don't know. Right? It's about opening ourselves up to the contingent, the unpredictable, realizing that whatever stage we're in life, whether it's really good or really bad, the world can change, and it can change multiple times. There's the predictable future, the future that we can kind of have a good idea what's going to happen. I have a good idea what's going to happen tomorrow, right? I've got a good idea what I do during the week. And then there's the apocalyptic future where you meet somebody and it changes everything. Or, you get diagnosed with a disease and it changes everything. But it's that thing that you can't really predict, but that changes the whole map and changes the future and also changes how you interpret the past. So that was the theme, Apocalypse. And it was fun and it worked. And Chris, who was at the bar, I went over to him and he said, right, you're on next month as well. So he didn't even ask me. I wasn't even thinking of doing more than one. And at the time I thought it's because he really liked it. But in retrospect, I think it was just because we had 60 people in the bar. Like on Sunday nights, there were like 3 people usually, and we brought in a pile of people. We're drinking beer. He wouldn't have cared if we were Scientologists. He was just glad that we were there, right? So that's how Icon began. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we planned the gatherings and what they looked like. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I would do now. And you can ask any questions you want. There'll be plenty of time at the end of this. What kind of happened is after the first one, there were some people in the room who were like, we like this. There was a really good friend of mine, Johnny McEwen, who became central to Icon, and I've toured with him. I've got his art on the walls. Johnny McEwen, check out his work online. JONNYMCEWEN, Johnny McEwen. Brilliant Irish artist, but also incredibly creative person. He helps me run other events. Anyway, so he was there and he said to me years later, he said, I got involved because he said, I thought this would be better if there was a soundscape through it. because he's also a musician. He says there needs to be some sort of soundscape. And he also said, and I also thought this could easily become a cult, so I should probably be in there to maybe prevent that from happening. So he was worried that I'd become a cult leader, and he also thought there'd be cool music would really add to the vibe. So he got involved. A couple of other people, similar things. They were like, oh yeah, I think I could contribute to this. So then we had a team. We had a team, maybe 5 or 6 people, and this didn't change actually for 11 years. But what we would do is we would meet on I think it was a Monday night, and we'd maybe meet at the local pub or meet at the apartment or the house that I was living in with others at the time. And on the first night we would meet of the month, we would kind of talk about a possible theme. That was kind of the general chat, have a laugh, have a think about a concept that we would like to explore. Now, I did most of the heavy lifting on that one. Like, I was the one who was mostly coming in with ideas. I mean, I say heavy lifting, it wasn't very heavy lifting, but I would come in and go, oh, what about something on like chaosmos, the idea of chaos and cosmos or something like that. And we would throw a few ideas around and we kind of land on something. However, often it wasn't a theme. Often it was a kind of like Johnny would come in with a vision of something. He would go, what would it look like if the bar was just covered in broken wine glasses and we were pouring red wine into the broken wine glasses and the wine was dripping from the glasses and onto the floor? Or what would it look like if we had all these helium balloons, the same colour, like a blue-grey colour, and they were weighted so they neither went up or down? So when you walked into the room, you were walking into this room just full of suspended balloons. And then as everyone's walking in, we take a picture of them jumping in the air so that also on the walls you see projections of everybody suspended in midair. Right? So we would maybe always come in just with a kind of like thing of something that he thought would look cool. And then we would go, oh yeah, that's interesting, because in a way we're all suspended between birth and death. We're suspended between who we are and who we'd like to be. We're suspended between what we have and what we would like to have. There's something about being human, which is about being suspended between knowing and unknowing, between the earth and the heavens. Like, there's something interesting about that space. In fact, anxiety is the name for that space. So maybe we could do something about that, right? And going like about, instead of hating this, instead of wanting to float to the heavens or ground ourselves in the earth, somehow, how do we enjoy living the in-between? Right. So that would that would be a kind of theme that would come up. Or he would say something like, I was thinking it would be really interesting to have a massive pillow fight. Again, like that was one I resisted for months before finally we kind of had a really good idea for what we could do with a pillow fight. I can't for the life of me remember what the theme was, but I do remember we had a massive pillow fight in the black box. And it was exhausting. Didn't realise how utterly exhausting a pillow fight was. We did it to Rage Against the Machine. One song, 3 minutes long. Thought this will be easy. And we're all unfit. And about 1.5 minutes into the song, most of us were just coughing up blood and lying on the ground. But it was a lot of fun, So that would be the kind of the theme. And then the second Monday, we would kind of start to flesh it out. And we'd start to think about, like, okay, what kind of ritual could we do? What kind of immersive environment could we create? What kind of shared experience would fit with that? And so we begin to chart that out. By the third week, we would give rules to everybody. Okay, Pete, you say, so you do 5 minutes at the top end, tell a story. Again, I say something reflective that draws us in. So that was my job. They never allowed me to speak for more than about 5 minutes, right? Because it was not a theory thing, and it was always very, very artistic, very kind of, I say either a parable or almost kind of a very prosy kind of opening, which always ended with "Welcome to Icon," because I did the first few where I would say, if you're not sure where you belong, if you're this, if you're that, if you're whatever, then welcome to Icon. And then that kind of became the way I would always end my thing, which kind of like becomes cheesy, and then eventually you do it long enough and it becomes not cheesy again. So I would do my 5 minutes. Then we would have Padre Gutuma who would say, listen, Padre, can you do some poetry? Can you do a song? Can you do something? There was a guy who was really into the Russian Orthodox tradition and really knew his mystics, and go like, can you think of something that you could do with some mystical kind of text? And he might read something like about fire, but be wearing clothes that have all been burned, right? So the rules would kind of be given out. And then on the last week, we would just get together early, set everything up, and do the night. And we did that probably nine months of the year, so 9 gatherings a year, plus a festival, so 10 a year. And we probably take 2 months off, maybe a month in the summer, maybe at Christmas. And we did that for 11, I think it was 11 years. Let me give you some other examples then of what this looked like. Instead of giving you one full gathering, I just want to paint pictures, right? They were all very different. So one time there was this abandoned police station that was in the centre of Belfast. So we were able to get permission to use this abandoned police station. And my goodness, it was like a horror movie when you went into it. It was like so dark, and it was all boarded up, and these interrogation rooms and the cells and the basement, and it had this really, really spooky feel. And we did a night called Resuscitation, where everybody came in, and again, I can only remember bits and pieces, but there were some people with like medical forms as people came in, and they were taking notes, and everyone kind of got these medical forms which were asking these weird questions about resuscitation and death and life. But it looked like it was like a waiting room for a hospital. And then we had this guy called Kazi, really good guy, Steve Caswell, who was dressed like a patient, and he had one of those stands which had the IV on it, the IV drip. And he comes in and he says, right, I'm your guide for the evening. And so in 2 groups, because there was another person I think as well, so in 2 groups, people were guided loosely around the police station until, halfway through they got to the top, and then eventually into the basement. And each of the different rooms we gave to different artists. So we had like maybe 12 or 15 different artists, and we would give them a room. So one guy had a room that he painted black. I think it might have already been black. And he wore hardly anything, just like little trunks. He was super skinny, and he had chalk, and he chalked all of these crazy things all over the walls. And you walk in and he's just chalking this kind of stuff. I can't remember what it was, but very powerful. Another room, there was a musicians playing, and upstairs there was a psychoanalyst, and this is very crazy. Psychoanalyst was psychoanalyzing this empty bed with this image of Christ projected above it, and talking about resuscitation and resurrection. And at one point he takes out little vials that look like they're full of blood, and he says, this is our blood given for each other, and starts to hand out the blood. And one of my friends who can't stand the sight of blood fainted, so that really added to the whole vibe. So, taking this experience right down into the basement where everyone just looked at each other in the eyes for 3 minutes. All I can remember is these little moments to give you a feel for it. Or another one, which I really enjoyed, just a little moment, is we did this gathering upstairs in this bar. Open fire, it was rainy and cold outside. And the only thing I remember about the gathering was it was about opening ourselves up to things that we are embarrassed about, humiliated about, things that we'd rather forget, things that we don't like about ourselves. And we had these reflections, but what we did is at one point we all wrote something down that we're embarrassed about, a belief we're embarrassed about, something in our past that we wish hadn't happened, something very difficult that we actually feel we couldn't share with anybody in the room because we would be judged, right? Something that the other people in the room potentially would really look down on us for and judge us for. We wrote these down, we put them in a pot, and then people just randomly took them, and without reading them, everybody made an incision in the inner lining of their jackets. It was cold and wet, so everyone had their jackets. So made an incision and then put this into the jacket without reading it, and then sewed it up. Right? And so again, this ritual of somehow we're carrying this for each other. And by the way, that's a good example of, we always wanted these rituals that captured something, but also that had room for expansive interpretation. We didn't want to nail down the interpretation too much. like, we didn't do this that night, but what you could have done is you could have had 3 people reflecting on what this means to them. And it's not that the ritual has no meaning, like it's just a relativistic thing. It's more that it's very pregnant with meaning. It kind of allows for multiplicity of meaning, which again allows people to enter into it without agreeing or disagreeing with it, but rather feeling the power of this experience. A similar one is when we used rice paper, and with food colouring we wrote our beliefs, something that we believed, and then during one of the rituals we gave them to another person and said, these are my beliefs broken for you. And then the other person would consume them, would eat them. And we did this whole reflection about how we want our beliefs, whatever they are, to sustain the other. We want to share them with the other. We want them to be consumed by the other and say sustain the other. So, and it's also part of us that we give of ourselves. We want our beliefs to be something we give to the other. Another one that I remember was quite nice was there's a guy called Ian Paisley, and Ian Paisley is the equivalent of some sort of like fundamentalist figure in America, like Jerry Falwell or something like that. So he's a very, very fiery man who founded a church denomination called the Free Presbyterians, who are like a really fundamentalist sect. And he was a very powerful man. He was a very charismatic man and a very angry man in his youth. We met him actually during doing the evangelism project, and I'll maybe talk about that in the next session. But this was a guy who a lot of people had very negative feelings about. But Johnny found this sermon of his called The Singing Ministry of Christ. And it was this very beautiful fundamentalist sermon, but it was really beautiful. And he kept coming back to this phrase of the singing ministry of Christ. And so what Johnny did is one night he played the whole sermon in 2 halves with DJs playing music over the top of it. And everybody had rocks on the different tables. And every time this guy, Ian Paisley, said something that they liked, you would take a rock and you would put it on one table. And if you said something you didn't like, you put a rock and put it on the other table. And as the evening went, you kind of started to see that this figure of hatred, more and more rocks were on the side of, that was beautiful, that touched me, that meant something, that was a little kiss of grace to me, right? And then halfway through the sermon, this guy called Jeff, who's, to give you a little bit of context, Ian Paisley is a unionist. He was a unionist. So he was Protestant unionist, wanted Northern Ireland to be kept as part of the United Kingdom, right? And he was very strongly unionist, connected with paramilitary groups, etc. And Jeff was a Republican, and in a very Republican family, nationalist, Catholic, the complete opposite. And Jeff gets up and he tells a story. He says, listen, my twin brother, he said, died of cancer. And this happened a few years ago, and the guy was in his 20s, so it was really horrible, right? The cancer just ate him away and he died. But shortly before he died, something happened where a friend of the family's was talking to Ian Paisley's daughter and said about this guy dying of cancer. And Ian Paisley's daughter mentioned it to her father. And so Jeff says, it's just talking in this room full of people, and he says, we were at the hospital, the Royal Hospital, and we're all gathered around my twin brother, and there's a lot of people there, and this is close to the end. And who shows up? It's walking down the corridor is Ian Paisley, this big man. You should look him up if you're watching this live. Look at this big man with his bodyguards. We had to have bodyguards, so you've got the 2 big bodyguards. You've got this massive guy, Ian Paisley, the figure of the enemy, the absolute enemy. And he comes up, and in the soft of voices Ian Paisley can have, he's like, listen, I heard about what was happening. This is terrible. He says, I just wanted to come, and I wanted to to see if you're okay. He's a politician. He says, I want to make sure that anything you need, you let me know. This is my personal number. And he said, would you let me pray with you? And the family, all these Republicans are standing there looking at this guy, and they're like, okay. So Ian Paisley kneels down beside Jeff's brother and he prays. And he gets up He says again to the family, anything you need at all, you just call me. Gets up and he leaves. This is not publicity. There's nobody knows about this, just this personal act. And Jeff's standing in the room going, I don't know what to do with that. He says, I don't know where to put that in my head. I don't know how to reconcile that with everything that I blame Ian Paisley for. He says, all I can say is it happened. All I can say is that I was there and that happened. And then he sat down, and then the second half of the sermon came up, again with the music. And no explanation, not a sense of going like, oh, you have to agree with this, or you have to disagree with this, or you have to change your opinion, or you shouldn't change your opinion, or anything. It was just going, let's sit in this room and feel this and see what happens and see how we feel and see what takes place. Is there any other ones that I should mention? There's so many. I wrote a couple down here. Let's see. Oh yeah, I'll mention a couple more. There was always a critique that the icon could be a bit wordy. So I remember we decided to do an icon where there was only 100 words, and so it started off, tonight icon gives you 100 words, the 13th of which is welcome to icon. Think of that. That was the first 13 words. And then we took people on a journey around the city, and we had people set up. We had this guy Ben, who's an artist. He was papering up this incredible image. I think it's a Banksy image actually, of a guy in a top hat, just with a sign, like top hat, umbrella, suitcase, with the sign saying lonely. And then we walked past somebody who was homeless, who was holding up a sign saying invisible. And we all got our picture taken outside this fashion shop called Cult. Right? And we went around this interesting journey where we had literally 100 words, so we gave ourselves a limit. We had 100 words to use through this entire journey around the city. And we ended up at this church where we gave everyone chalk, and people chalked on the outside of the church, God rid me of God. So that was 5 words. And we did it right up to, they walked then into the church, and someone standing, probably me, standing at the front with like the last 10 words and gave the last 10 words, whatever they were, and that was it. So that was kind of like just a fun experience of going, right, okay, there's a critique, so how can we kind of answer the critique in an interesting way and respond to it and do something productive with it? And we did a couple of ones like that. We did one where in the days of CDs, you came to Icon and you were given a CD to go and put it in your car and do the tracks. The tracks gave you hints, like it was like a tour around the city, and it was called Convertible, because convertible, like a convertible car. But there were things like you had to go somewhere and you had to graffiti, I must be born again, and you had to go to somewhere where you had been converted in the city, something had happened that had transformed you, and all of these little kind of things to do over the course of the night. And then if you followed all of the things, you eventually find the conclusion where we had this whole thing set up an hour down the line. This is the kind of thing, it was just fun. What I kind of want to do by telling you all these stories is to go, we would sit and just have fun and go, what can we do this week? What kind of like experience can we play with and do? And some of them didn't work, and some of them worked incredibly, and some of them were in between. But they were all based on the stuff that I looked at in section 1. So if all the pyrotheological stuff in theory, this was the practice. This was trying to put it into some sort of feel that you would be able to, whether it was dipping your hands in red wine at Easter time, like kind of like as a sign of blood on our hands, whether it was doing communion with champagne and chocolate cake, where we were saying that religion often becomes this way of kind of like just selfishness, of kind of using this in some sort of very self-interested way. So I remember when we did that, somebody came out and stuffed chocolate cake in their face and drank champagne and then started walking around saying, this is the body of Christ, eat and drink. Very, very awkward kind of feeling. So these kinds of experiences, that was what Transformance Art started to feel like. And it was only once a month. And it was an hour, and then afterwards we'd hang out together, we'd have a drink together, but it had this experiential dimension. Now, if I was doing it again, which I probably will, potentially if I stay in LA, I'm 50-50 about that, but if I stay in LA, I'd like to start something weekly. It wouldn't look like that. It might look like that once every 4 or 6 weeks. But what I imagine is a space that is community space with some spoken word, some music, and maybe some ritualistic dimension, but that's helping the people to enter into this living in the space of the in-between, or embracing and looking at the things that they want to hide, that they're humiliated by, or that they want to hide from themselves, or how to integrate doubt, ambiguity, and complexity into their lives. All of these elements that are in what I've been describing to you. Just kind of expressing that, so that every week you're coming back to that notion, because we can so easily forget it. We're surrounded by a liturgy which tells us we can be whole and complete if we have the certain things, if we look the certain way. We're always looking for the thing that will fix things. So once a week there is that desert in the oasis where you go and you reflect on it's a space where you're free from the tyranny of certainty and satisfaction, where you're free to be dissatisfied and find the satisfaction in that dissatisfaction, to enjoy experiencing that. And you have to do it week in and week out. You have to do it regularly, because it's so easy to lose fidelity to that existential promise, that existential experience. We can be swayed so easily. So that with some concrete examples that I wanted to give. Yep, let's look at the time. I want to make sure there's plenty of time to ask questions afterwards. Is there anything else I want to say? No, I'll now look at questions. Hopefully you've had some questions on this, or you have any questions about how this... here's the problem. Doing this, scaling this up is very hard, right? To scale up what we were doing with Icon is difficult. I recommend people do it. There's Pyre, which is the group that's running at the moment. A friend of mine, Elliot, does this, which does similar things. There was an amazing group in Texas, in Waco, called Void, and they were doing similar things. There was a great group in Tasmania that I think they were called Bard Subject. And they were doing incredible things. There was a group in South Carolina called Shelter 50. There's different groups that have been doing similar things and were inspired by Wake. But it's hard to think that would become absolutely massive. So what I'm interested in is, yes, there has to be an element of that creativity. And I want there to be kind of liturgies that arise out of the theory of pyrotheology. There has to be liturgies and experiences that feel comfortable, like the passing of the bread, where we write our beliefs and we consume it, or like the sewing of each other's embarrassing stories into our jackets, which, by the way, could be quite scary. If somebody wrote, "I'm a drug dealer," and the police find that when you're going through customs, you're in trouble, right? But these experiences that their liturgies arise out of it, that can capture some of this. So there has to be an element of that. But also it can look very like what a regular church looks like. A group of people gathered together with spoken word and with music and with some sort of ritual. Doesn't have to be hyper creative. And then hanging out together at the end and trying to befriend each other. And we would always try to speak to the unspoken of the community. Like, what is it that would offend us? What is it that I need to hear? What is it that we can do that will challenge us in a productive and creative way? So like, if I was doing one next week, I probably would do something about, say, purity culture. There's lots of things you can do with dirt and cleanliness, right? There's loads of imagery there. Or I would do something about excommunication, or silence, or silencing, or there's lots of different kind of things that I would do which I think speak to the contemporary moment. But again, without being kind of like very dogmatic about it. That's what Johnny McEwen always brought to Icon, is he would just bring a visual. He said, I don't know what this means, but like, what if we, one of my favorites, what if we put someone on a stepladder So we put a woman on a stepladder with a woolen dress that we'll make from like we'll go to a secondhand store and we'll get all of this wool material and we'll make this woolen dress, right, goes right down to the floor, so it looks like she's 13 feet high, right? So you walk into the room and there's this woman standing in the center of the room with this woolen dress. And then what if the threads are coming from the dress to all of these different places in the room where people are knitting new clothes out of the unraveling of the old clothes, right? So you go like, yes, we have to do that. That would look amazing, right? And then what if we were wearing unraveling clothes? And so what if we do a service about unraveling and raveling and the pulling apart of something and the creating something new out of it, and this process of creation and disruption. Go like, yeah, so and not trying to be too tight on it, but just going like that visual captures something. And then of course the gift, because we always give a gift, is a little bit of the thread. Everybody goes up to the dress and cuts some of the thread, and they keep a little bit of the dress. That idea about raveling and unraveling. Or what if we gave everybody matches, and as they walk in, there's a fire alarm going off saying there's a fire in the building, step inside, and then you go in and there's a funeral pyre with smoke coming out of it, and we're all wearing burnt clothes, and we explore the idea of burning things up, whatever, right? So you have an image, and we go like, yes, we take that image that has enough richness to it, like a poem or a parable in itself, that has enough richness in it that people don't feel that they're, being, preached a very, very narrow message. And yet this kind of imagery captures something: the burning, the unraveling, the giving of the food to each other. All of this has a certain feel that's very pyrotheological. All right, let's see if you've got any questions. Oh yeah, Kevin says, just reading up on Zen, it also has 2 arms: sitting meditation and the koan. Yeah, it's funny, like that imagery of 2 things, like that's very common, the kind of almost the theory and the technology. And koans are a type of technology, so is the meditation. So yeah, it kind of makes sense to have those 2 elements. Kev says, a participatory art museum where the experience is embedded in interactive narrative. That's why we call it transformance art. It was actually a guy called Gilo, who came to an icon gathering, and he did a review of it for some magazine, and he said it felt like performance art, or perhaps I would call it transformance art. And when he said that, I was like, whoa. When I read that, I was like, that's what it is. It's transformance art. It's kind of like being in an art museum, but you are part of the practice, or being in a theatrical production, but you're part of the theatre. Which, ironically, religion and theatre all, I think, come from the same place. So theatre arises out of religious practice, so we were just kind of bringing it back in. Tim, question, yep. Did children, youth attend and participate? If not, any thoughts about reaching them with transformist liturgies? Yeah, mostly not. Mostly it was an evening on a Sunday night in a bar, and adults, mostly 20s, 30s, 40s. We did some stuff that involved children. When we went to Greenbelt Festival, we would sometimes do an event that was then an environment where kids would be part of it to some extent. But yeah, I don't have a lot of experience in that. So yeah, can't really say much. I used to say that our youth work was saying to kids, you can't come. And then that made it seem really, really special, because whenever you say you can't go to something, suddenly it becomes really exciting, so that when finally they're able to go, they'll be really excited about it. So it's a good way to keep them in. But yeah, don't know much about that, how to do this. I think it would work perfectly well, but I've got no examples. Even the ones that had kids at the festival, they were just allowed in, if you know what I mean. It wasn't like particularly geared towards young people. Let's see. Oh yeah, Tim says this is very important. Planning and fun sounds like what the staff writers of SNL do. The reason why I wanted to pick up on that, Tim, is the key thing was we had to enjoy it. Like, I know groups that were doing similar things. There was a book that was written and it had about 30 of these what were called alt worship groups. And by the time the book came out, at least half of them didn't exist anymore, right? Because it takes about 18 months for a book or whatever to come out. And the reason was because people, they're a lot of work and a lot of people got burnt out. We loved doing it. Like literally it was community. We looked forward to those Monday nights, not all the time, right? But most of the time we were like, that was like a fun part of our week. And we enjoyed everything about it. To give you another example, because I wanted to make this very rich with examples, but I might have mentioned this last time, but like we always did a lot of stuff, had a lot of things going on. So one time Chris Fry said like, what if we did nothing? Right? And we're like, oh, that would be really fun. Go like, okay, how do we do that? I go like, okay, so we'll have loads of things set up. When you go into the room, like just like a typical icon, you go in, there's projectors, there's candles, there's seats, there's weird stuff around that you don't know what it is. There's all of this stuff set up. There's the DJ booth, the music, there's the instruments. It's all set up. And the first 20 minutes of the gathering is putting it all away. So whenever people come in tonight, right, let's start. So everybody jointly puts everything away until there's only a circle of chairs. And then we say, sometimes our rituals can bring us together. And sometimes in Icon we do things that help us think and connect with ourselves, but sometimes these rituals can get in the way of connection. So tonight, Icon offers you nothing. And then go silent. And then there's 50 of us in a circle with no direction whatsoever, right? This is obviously a psychoanalyst thought of this one, Chris, because I hate this, because when there's silence like that, it's so embarrassing. Nobody knows, because no one's even been told that they can talk. No one's been told they can't talk, they can't talk. They haven't even been told the theme. The theme is just nothing. Tonight, Icon offers you nothing. And Chris is sitting there, he's leading this night. And he did the introduction. He says, so tonight, Icon offers you nothing. And he just sits there, completely calm. And everybody's kind of looking at each other. And we're planning this, by the way, and I'm going like, this sounds so difficult. I'm going to hate this. So I'm going like, we have to do this. This will be so much fun. And of course, on the night, it's like so awkward. And then somebody says something. I don't know if we're supposed to talk or not, but this made me think of this. And then this conversation starts happening, and it's this beautiful night. It's absolutely amazing. So we loved it. And every year, pretty much without fail, every year we would have a meeting after the 12 months, and we'd sit and we'd go like, do you want to give this up? Right? We've had a good run. Like, let's finish. We're all friends. Let's stop. And we would basically talk ourselves around to going, yeah, let's just finish up. Do one more, and then that's us. And then someone would say, without fail, if we were to do more, I would love to have done this. And then they would mention something, and they would talk, and we'd all be like, "Oh, we have to do that." There's so many times I remember that conversation. Let's finish. You go like, "Yeah, something I wish we'd done." And then as soon as they said it, we're like, "Okay, well, let's do it for a little bit longer." And it just kept going like that. So fun, enjoyment is so important. Otherwise, you'll burn out. Let's see. Question. There's one question. Kev, do you think transformance art is related to a conversion experience? Does it create a space where people convert to the freedom from the frenetic pursuit? Yes. I mean, that's it in a nutshell. When I was 17, I had my conversion experience, and it was a radical rebirth. As in, you don't experience birth. Birth is what opens you up to experience. You don't experience life. Life is what allows you to experience. So this conversion, as you know, is this moment at which nothing changes, but nothing remains the same. You suddenly see everything differently. It's a new modality of experience. And Icon was all about that. And that's why the first one was called Apocalypse. And it was called Apocalypse on purpose. I didn't know there was going to be more of them at the time, but I knew the first one, or the only one, had to be about apocalypse, which is your world ends and something utterly new begins. A new way of being arises. And yes, so Icon was always a place, and we even talked about this explicitly, where we invited conversion. It was an invitation to us all to put ourselves in a type of position where that type of reconfiguration could take place. Central to the vision of Icon. Central. Sorry, this keeps on bouncing up and down as people write things. Let's see. Hillary. Ditto to Mark. The building of the team seems so critical. How to find the right partners. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I was very lucky. I mean, some of the people on the team are people who now have big platforms. Like Padraig Otuma is he's doing really, really well. In fact, he's just released his book In the Shelter. The American edition has just come out, and The Edge from U2 endorsed it. Like, The Edge from U2. I'm a big U2 fan. Unpopular as it is these days, I'm a big fan. And Padraig was always such a talented individual and is doing very, very well. And then Johnny McEwen, who's like really one of the most one of Northern Ireland's best known and one of Ireland's best known painters, and like he's semi-abstract artists. We had some incredible people. So what advice can I give on that? Because it's like a band. I suppose if you're in a band in school, it's all about what the magic brings. And if the magic isn't there, here's a tip. Okay, I'll give you a couple of tips. You want tips, right? This is true. Here's something about Rob Bell. You don't know, well, you might know, but I'll tell you straight away, right? Rob Bell, to me, it always looks like everything he does works. It doesn't. He just has the same batting average as everybody else. He actually has a better batting average because he's very talented, right? But he still misses ones, right? The point is, when he misses them, you don't know because he just goes on to the next thing. I had a number of things before Icon that just didn't really work. So where the group just wasn't quite right, and we still did a few good things, and then you just let it die and you move on. So, but it's like this thing of going like, yeah, you just, sometimes if the ideal team doesn't come together, don't say from the start, hey, we're going to do this forever. You go like, let's do a one-off. Let's do 3 things together. And if the magic is there, or starting to get there, then it'll snowball, and you'll get, and then talent brings talent. We could always have some new people because we had this team of very talented individuals, and if somebody might come in who was very new, and the great thing is they would always stay quite silent in the meetings at first because they just respected the people who'd been doing it for 5 or 6 years. But then gradually they would begin to speak and begin to be encouraged in, and they'd get better and better. And then a new person. So we could always have a couple of people who were kind of earlier on, not so good, once we had the established team, and then they could be trained up like a mentorship. But yeah, there's definitely, like Rob, as I say, there's things he's done and it hasn't worked. And the reason why you don't hear about it is Rob just brushes it off his shoulder, goes, tried that, didn't work, I'll do this. And then you hear the things that work. You don't hear about the things before Icon because they just didn't work. The magic. But when you do something that's really good, and by the way, the other thing I had is I'd spent years in a community, in a church, and I'd spent years building that up. So when I started a new thing, actually people showed up. They trusted, they didn't know what it was, but like 50 or 60 people showed up. And then out of that, some of the people were starting to go, I'd like to be involved in this. So sometimes you need to spend a lot of time kind of, which many of you have done, I know, is like in, say, a church where you've got a level of respect or a level of leadership. And then when you try the new thing, people will come to it. And then out of that will come your team. So the team is so important. You're absolutely right. You only need 2 or 3 people who are really good. And then it grows from there. But that's very key. Nicole, practical question. How did you fund something like this? Oh, that's very good. Donation. Yeah, it was very funny because somebody once wrote about Icon. There's a point where it was doing very well and people were starting to take notice. And one of the critiques was, this is all very well, but how do you do this if you don't have money? Because basically they were assuming that all these gatherings, because they kind of sound and look pretty grandiose, but they cost nothing. There was no, we did have what we call it was a communal purse, and you could put money into it or take money out of it, and it was more of a symbolic thing, but it was always there. And the idea is, if you needed a bit of money, you take some money out. If you had a bit extra, put a bit extra in. I don't know if we ever made anything from it. I'm sure we did, but we got everything. Now this is a very Northern Irish thing. It's very European because it was very cheap to live in Belfast, and when I first moved to America, I went to some seminaries and I talked about icon. It was when I was doing this practical stuff, and I kept getting this question and I didn't understand it. And the question was, how did you afford to do this? Right? And I was like, well, I said I was on an unemployment benefit for 8 years. We just unemployment benefit. We just kind of like found a bar, we'd whatever. And it was only like about probably 6 months into being in America where I went, oh, it's different here, because you come out of university with like a lot of debt, and it's much harder to be unemployed. It's much, you don't have health insurance, all of that kind of stuff. And it's like, oh, it's not the same thing. Because in Northern Ireland, especially then, you could get everything for free. Like, the bar for free, as long as you put people in the bar. You could live very cheaply, and everything we did was things like using secondhand stores to make, say, the woolen dress, or if we, like even things like the rituals of cutting your jacket, or all these things, like none of it cost anything. It was everything was volunteer. Nobody got paid, me, anybody, like nobody got anything. And it was easy, but I understand that it's maybe more difficult now. Even if I was doing it today in Northern Ireland, it might be more difficult. You might have to pay for a bar. You might have to, it takes more work. There was a real stress, actually. See, whenever I started to get well known, when I wrote my book, How Not to Speak of God, and there was every year, this is actually a good thing to say, but every year we would have a day where the organisers, anybody could go, but basically it was for people who were part of organising Icon, would have a whole day together. And Chris Fry, a psychoanalyst, a couple of times he led it. So we called it the Friday. And I remember the year that and to be honest, we probably didn't do it every year, actually. That's me rewriting history. But we tried to, like once a year on a regular basis, try to have a day where we just listen to each other. So in case there's tensions, tensions always arise in groups. So this is a way to get all the tensions out, bring it all to the surface, see how people are feeling. And Chris Fry's way of leading as an analyst is very much saying nothing, very little. And after lunch, he asked this brilliant question, right? After lunch, we got in, there was about 12 or 15 of us in a circle. I had no idea anything was wrong. We were all just sitting. And Chris Fry said, did any of you have a conversation over lunch that you would find difficult expressing now in this room? Sounds like such a simple question. But of course, after a morning of talking about Icon and stuff together, over lunch, people say the things that they wouldn't say, right? So over lunch, you're like, that person's pissing me off, whatever. And so the first thing somebody said was, well, Pete's just written this book. Is he the authority on what Icon is now? Are we emerging church? Because we'd never even used that term. We used the term emerging, ironically, in our mission statement. We had these coordinates. Icon is iconic, apocalyptic, heretical, emerging, and feeling. So emerging was our fourth coordinate. But we never knew anything about the American emerging church. And now I was being adopted by that. And they said, so are we part of this movement now? Like, we never talked about this. And there was this tension, and it was great. I'd already gone through this once as a leader in a church. So I was actually a lot better, going like, don't take it personally. But it was that moment of the death of the leader. It was like, hey, you're not the one who speaks entirely for us. But it was the experience where you can start to bring all of this to the surface. Now, why am I talking about that? What was the question? Donations and volunteers. I don't know. Oh yeah, volunteer. Because the problem was, of course, I was now starting to make a living. Well, not at that time, but I was on the way to potentially making a living doing this kind of work. And that kind of was something that had to be talked out in the community. And then eventually I moved to America, and they kept going without me for another year. And by the way, that's not to say that's the way it should be done. Like if you can afford, if there's a church used to give us money, my old church, right? Do you want to hear the story? It's terrible. I'm telling all these stories. You can, if you're bored, drop off is okay. But I was part of this church, and the pastor brought me in. I did this sermon once. I was young, right? And I did this sermon that was controversial because it was a very charismatic evangelical church. And I started off purposefully doing a very boring talk about the Bible. And then embarrassingly, this is embarrassing to talk about, but what I did is I took the Bible I was using and I ripped it in half, and I ripped it again, and I threw it across the room, right? And then I did this talk about kind of like, this is only ink on paper. Like this is not sacred. It's when it's incarnated. It's whenever we take the words and when we become the word. And I maybe referenced Fahrenheit 451 or whatever it's called, where the people actually become the books that they're reading. Books are being burned, so they become the book, right? So some people complained about that, and so I was probably not going to be able to speak again. And funnily enough, one of the elders said, "What if Pete had snapped a CD-ROM?" And they were like, "Well, that would be different." Like, well, that's the point. It wouldn't really be different, a CD-ROM. But anyway, I was called into the office, and Paul Reed is the name of the guy. He said, "Pete, first of all," he says, "we would love Icon to be part of this community," because I was beginning to leave. "We'd like Icon to be part of this community." And he says, "To be honest with you, I pretend that it is part of it. Whenever somebody asks us, what are we doing? It's this new, I mentioned Icon, so I would love to kind of get you involved. And we'll give you some money and we'll support you." Eventually, I kind of was like, "No, we can't do that." But they still supported it for a while and they gave money to it, even though ultimately they had a very different position. They were very gracious and gave us money. So we always had a little bit of money coming in that way. That reminded me of that. Okay. Question. How can we do this online? I know, before social distancing finishes. Kate has also brought this up, and there probably are ways to do it. And in fact, we might try and do something at Wake. Johnny McEwen has great ideas, and he, like, for example, something we might do, I don't think we are going to do this, but we might do, is part of Wake, we might ask people to have certain things with them. So to go out and buy all stuff that you can get in a supermarket or store very easily, but a certain kind of set of things that we might be able to get people to do, or to go out and take a photo 100 feet from their house and then post that up. There are ways of potentially doing something communally, creatively. He's been doing some of that. So maybe I should get him into one of these Pyro seminars if you're interested, because he's the creative genius, right? See, some of these ideas that I'm pretending are mine, they come from Johnny, right? I was the ideas guy. He was the creative genius. So maybe I could get him in. So there are probably ways of doing it. But Johnny McEwen would be, in terms of the people I know, he'd be the guy I'd want to talk to about how that might actually look, because it needs to be immersive, it needs to be communal, it needs to feel that we're connected, and that is hard to do, as you know. On this, I mean, I'm talking to you, and I try to bring the same energy as I would if I was in front of people, but it's hard to have the same energy when it's looking into a camera that looks like Hal. But yeah, that's a very good question, Paulo. And maybe we'll try it with Wake. I just don't want to promise, because I want to make sure we do it right. And the more kind of like with Icon, we always allowed ourselves to feel. As I said, the 5 coordinates were Icon is iconic, apocalyptic, emerging, heretical, emerging, and feeling. And the feeling was important, where we would very much say, if this doesn't work, that worked. That's like a scientist, when a certain direction doesn't work, well, you learn something from it, So I mean, the only thing I ever worried about was whenever I occasionally had people from America, for example, saying we're going to fly over to be part of Icon, and I'd be like, guys, you might come to the really crap one. Like, a lot of these don't work. And like, I don't want you to fly all the way over from America to one that's like really rubbish. So, you roll the dice and take your chance, right? But so with Wake, I was always the worried one. I was always the one who wanted things to work. And it was always good to be around people who said, no, it doesn't have to work. So with Wake, maybe I have to have a little chaos in there, that's something that might not work. Get rid of my obsessive side. This is great. Question, Kev. Can you see communion as a transformance art act? If so, has the liturgy become lifeless and loses transformative power as the practice becomes codified? Yes, 100%. We got most of our good ideas from the church, right? Like, a lot of the stuff that we did, like we did Tenebrae. We did a Tenebrae gathering where I forget exactly what you do, but you blow out candles, right, during this Tenebrae, and then you close the Bible, right? This is something that that happens within Orthodox Church, right? You have so we got a massive Bible like this. We found one really dusty and old and broken and cracked, and it was open, and we had these candles. And as the Tenebrae service continued, we blew out these candles, and then the final act was the closing of the book. And it's a very beautiful and powerful experience, but it had lost its thing, but we had to recontextualize it, and it became profoundly powerful again. So yeah, a lot of these rituals, they do lose their currency. Nietzsche talks about coins that eventually, if you use a coin so much, the face comes off, and then it's worthless. You can't use it anymore because the imprint is gone. And so sometimes these rituals kind of are like that. They become rote. And so you have to do something with them. And even sometimes that's why we did champagne and chocolate cake. Because in a way, by doing champagne and chocolate cake, it's so disturbing in the context that we did it, that then the next time you do communion, it can have a new power, a new significance. So you've literally re-symbolized it by just putting it in contrast to another. You could have done that in the same night. I don't think we did, but if you had champagne and chocolate cake, someone stuffing chocolate cake down their face and champagne all over them and giving out champagne and chocolate cake, going, Christian, this is what it is. This is Christ's body. And the tension. And then it goes dark. And then there's a change in the atmosphere. And then somebody reads something about the fractured, broken Christ. Somebody reads something from liberation theology. And then communion. Bread and the wine. I guarantee that will be the most powerful communion most of those people in the room have had in the last 10 years. And you didn't change anything about the communion, you just changed the context of it. So it's about kind of like trying to return to the potentiality and the radicality in some of these rituals. I say we made some up, we did some new ones, but a lot of them were taken directly from the tradition. We never did Ash Wednesday, but we could have done something amazing with Ash Wednesday. You know, that's amazing. Putting ash on your face, remembering that you are but mortal. That's brilliant, you know. Bill, question. Is it a psychoanalytic model with the team priests as analysts and attendees doing transference and being led to the cure? Yeah. Yes, kind of, pretty much, yeah. One of the reasons, there's only a few, but one of the main reasons why I'm interested in psychoanalysis and done so much study in that is it's not because I want to be a psychoanalyst, right? Obviously I don't do it. I don't have any clients. That's not what I do. I'm not trained for that. I'm just in the theory because there is a type of psychoanalysis that I want to do, but it's in this liturgical group setting. It's free, so anyone can participate in it. And it has a similar, as you're saying, structural role. In terms of, I'm not sure if you heard it, but for anybody else as well, like the session that I did before this kind of like actually goes into that. It really looks at how the transformance art has a lot of analogies to what goes on in the clinic, in the analytic clinic. Reason for psychoanalysis then is, yes, it informs deeply how the liturgical gathering works. And it's also the reason why Hegel is so important is Hegel's notion of Christianity is all about this type of rupture, this type of fragmentation. And so the perfect blend, really, at the moment, is Hegel's Christianity and Lacanian psychoanalysis. Great. That's why I like Todd McGowan and Slavoj Žižek, because that's what they do. They're both Hegelian Christians. So, yeah, in the last session, what I talked about is how people project onto me or anybody who's doing the liturgy. So Padraig, if he's singing a song, without thinking about it, they become the stand-in for God. They become the incarnation of the absolute. So whenever Padraig sings a beautiful song from an album, which I recommend everyone get, called Hymns to Swear By, I think you can get it free online, Hymns to Swear By. Whenever he sings this beautiful hymn of brokenness and anger and frustration and journey, it's kind of like you're hearing the voice of God. And because you've projected, you've transferred your relationship to God onto Padraig, and then Padraig feeds back this brokenness, this openness, this doubt and complexity, then that is brought back into you. You identify with it, and it changes how you understand the absolute. So yeah, there's loads of connections there. Absolutely, Bill. That's why I think, for me, psychoanalysis as a theory needs, if people want to really understand what pyrotheology is, to do some work in that, which you've been doing, all of you who follow me, because I do a lot in that. Let's see. I'm only looking for the word question, by the way, so if you're asking a question, it doesn't have question beside it, I might miss it. I apologise. There's Eric. I'm just saying that because I saw one. So, I'm a musician at a church. Do you think that there is a way to bring these ideas into already existing church music? I'm so glad I saw this. Or is it best to start something else from scratch? Okay, lots of things to say. One is, this is a big debate in my head and with people I know, or it was. Is it better to stay in or go out? Good arguments either way. Won't get into that because I like the first part of the question. I do think so. Brilliant. And music is the place. Definitely you have to listen to hymns to swear by, as an example, but also I think Michael Gungor's early music maybe did this. I know David Bazan's music, Curse Your Branches, that album kind of does it. Is it a type of hymn that embraces doubt, complexity, ambiguity, and struggle? It looks more like the Psalms. The great thing is you can do this within an already existing community, as long as you and the pastor are working together. So, for example, here's an example. The pastor does a 12-week series on the Psalms and draws out the frustrations, the angers, the doubts, the uncertainties, and how this is put into beautiful music, right? So that's setting that up. And then you're coming in with music that maybe you've written or you've taken from others that kind of expresses and embodies that. Now, the reason why I'm saying you need to work in tandem is because this is the worst thing that happens, and it used to happen to me, and I keep a close eye on it, is if I went in to speak, if I'm surrounded by the God of certainty and satisfaction, then what I say, it's like a knife surrounded in bubble wrap. It just doesn't land. It lands, and then it gets blunted by everything else. Everything in the liturgy basically goes against this one element. So if you come in on your own and everything else in the liturgical hour is kind of saying the opposite, it's going to blunt what you do. It'll still touch a few people, but it also might seem discordant. So what one wants to do is to somehow work with the other people who have these central roles to kind of work together towards this. And you don't have to, it's very key, it's not about teaching pyrotheology as some sort of doctrine at all. Like, it's the same way in psychoanalysis. The analyst doesn't sit there and tell you the theory. They do the work. So you do the work, but the role of the pastor is to kind of help to paint a prose picture through, say, the Psalms of then what you enact. And then that will give people permission to enter into the music that you create. Now, as to whether to stay or to go, that's a toughie. And I think it's almost like the Reformation, Protestant Reformation, where it was the moment when Luther decided to go that he actually had more influence on the church as it existed. The Catholic Church itself then went through a transformation and Second Vatican and all of that later on. So sometimes, yes, starting your own thing is actually what, not only are you able to start it, but it also has more influence than if you stayed within it. Like, when you stay within it, sometimes you have less influence than when you leave. That's my experience. The moment that I stepped away is actually the moment that probably I had more influence in the church. But, give it a try within. And as long as you have, I could tell you, I've got so many sad stories. I've got a good friend who was a pastor in a church in Northern Ireland. And he was young, intelligent, charismatic. He was in this kind of position that we're talking about. He thought the leadership team had his back. They didn't. And this has happened to two of my friends. He went on sabbatical and he came back and he didn't have a job. And I did warn him because I'd seen it before then. I was like, are you sure people are going with you? And he's going, yeah. He's like, you sure they're not just saying yes in front of you, but they're saying other things behind your back, right? They're not having that space like Chris Fry created where everybody can actually be honest, right? Because I said, I'd be worried that you're going to get kicked out. Now, the truth is, I think he wanted to get kicked out. I think he was done. And he got what he wanted. but he couldn't do it, so he basically got other people to do it through him. It's like breaking up with somebody. You can't break up with them, so you create the atmosphere where they break up with you, right? So I think that's kind of what was going on unconsciously, and he's a lot happier now. But still, he did consciously think that everyone was going his direction, and they didn't have his back. So if I was sitting one-to-one with you, I'd be asking, who's got your back? Who doesn't? What's the situation? I'd want to know a lot. I'd want to get a whole picture of the situation you're in to help you kind of go, right, what's the best route forward? But hopefully that was helpful. Paulo mentions Curating Worship by Johnny Baker. Yes, Johnny Baker was one of those early alt worship people. Maybe that was the book. Maybe that was the book I was referring to that had all of the alt worship groups that were half of them were finished by the time it came out. That could be true. This is the amazing thing about Google. People can find things as soon as you talk about them. There's a book called The Rise and Fall of the 9 o'clock Service. Probably very hard to get, super niche, but really worth reading if you want to know a little bit about the history of one of the biggest screw ups in the alt worship movement that kind of destroyed it in many ways. Someone's asking me, these are not Johnny McEwen. That is a guy called John McCormick, who's an artist from Northern Ireland, a friend. Johnny McEwen, let me see if this works very quickly. That's a Johnny McEwen there. And then there's a few others dotted around which you can't see from that angle. But there you go. Definitely check out his work online. Let's see. I'm going to keep going as long as there's questions. There's only a couple more, but you can watch this later if you want, because I know we've been going for a while. Let's see. Oh no, there's only two more, I think. Mark Greer. Would love to connect with other like-minded people who live in my area. Yes, others might feel the same. I am from Vancouver Island, British Columbia. It's funny you say that. Literally today, I have a friend in Rome, and we were chatting, and I was like trying to connect her with people in Rome because she's COVID, been pretty isolated. She's like, do you know anybody in Rome? And I was able to go to some people I know in Europe and say, like, any of you got friends in Rome? A couple of people came up. I don't know what's going to work, but I'm connecting those three people together. And it did remind me of the importance of trying to connect us. So use Discord. Go on the Discord. There's a where are you from in Discord. Go in there and look at where people are from, all of you, and put in where you're from and try and find people who are connected. Use the Facebook page. And maybe if you've got an idea about how I can help with that, let me know. Like, is there a way to have some app, right? Is there an app that does this? Is there a software that we can all sign into and say where we're from, when it shows kind of loosely, without exact addresses, obviously, kind of where people are from? Bill, you're a computer guy. If you've got any advice on that, because that would be kind of cool. Like if all of us could just put in our cities, and you could literally see where everybody is. So you could maybe connect. I would love to do that, but I don't have the know-how, but I'm really happy to help it happen if someone else has the know-how. Kev thought, transformance art and decentering practices seek to move our master signifier, the arbiter of meaning, from the conditional to the unconditioned. That's very good. So transformance art and decentering practices seek to move our master signifier from the conditional to the unconditioned. Yes, that's very well. I think that's very well said. So, if I get you correctly, and for everybody else, it's like a conditioned is like say what gives me meaning is the flag, my nation, right? My nation, right or wrong, I will die for my country, right? But it's a condition that's like my country, right or wrong. Doesn't matter whether it's good or bad, I'll die for my country. There's something very profoundly powerful and self-sacrificial in that. But also, you can end up dying for something bad. But the point is not to get rid of that, right? The point potentially is to say that is the unconditional, is to go, my country stands for, at its best, freedom and justice and freedom and justice and the pursuit of happiness, whatever it is. I forget what the American dream is, but you say my country is about it was a place of freedom and a place of welcoming everyone, and I will die for that. Now that's unconditional in a sense, because it's justice, but it's not idolatrized. It's connected to your country, but it's also something that transcends it. Is within it and transcends it. And so for Paul Tillich, that wouldn't be demonic. The first is demonic, where we say we give ourselves over to some conditioned thing, something. But when we give ourselves over to the unconditional, it's this notion of justice that is not captured in anything, but transforms how we relate to everything. So Kev, I think that's a beautiful way of saying it, is that moving from the conditioned to the unconditional. And for anybody who's new to this, I think reading Paul Tillich is great on that. My Search for Absolutes is very good. The New Being. I've done some courses on his work as well, which you can find on Patreon. So yeah, thank you. All right. There's one more. Just bounced up. Can you speak briefly on the connection between transformance art and decentering practices? Can you frame a transformance liturgy as a communal decentering practice? So can you speak briefly in connection to transformance art and decentering practices? Okay, you know what? What I will do is, because the next one's going to be all about decentering practices, I'll save it for then, just because I've been on this for a long time, and that will also give me time to think about that answer. So bring that up, please, next month, and we'll talk about that and see the connection, and I'll have a think. But the interesting thing is, for me, like, transformance art is almost like equivalent to the weekly church, and the decentering practices are equivalent to the Tuesday night cell meeting, or the kind of the book group, or the whatever. It's kind of like there's the one where we all gather together and do something together, and then there's the special interest kind of things that you do in smaller groups. That's only a rough analogy, but that's how I kind of see it. Is like, yeah, so the liturgy is one for everybody to go to, and then the decentering practices, you kind of pick and choose which one you like, and they're for a smaller number of people. But I don't think that's an essential difference. So we'll maybe tease out the differences in the next session. All right, thank you so much for being part of this. Really appreciate it, and hopefully we'll be seeing some of you in person soon. At least I'll see some of you hopefully next month at Wake. So take care. Bye bye.